Space, the final frontier, home to such famous things as the moon, the sun, the International Space Station, and as of 2018, an electric car. Space has captivated humankind ever since the first Homo sapiens looked up at the night sky. I know this because I myself went to space camp twice. Even though space is wondrous and endless, the space around Earth is now being contested by geopolitical rivals. In anticipation of outer space becoming a new battle space, President Donald Trump's first administration created the Space Force.
The President is creating a new branch, Space Force.
The latest uniformed branch of the United States military. But what were the key factors that led the U.S. to creating a wholly independent Space Force? And what was the defense strategy like prior to its creation? Now, before we get into all this space war stuff, I think we should run through a quick-ish history lesson. Mankind's involvement in space is a very, very recent development. After World War II, it was the Soviet Union that made the first steps to conquer the final frontier. What initially appeared to be a demonstration of scientific achievement, showing that launching an object into space wasn't just theoretical, but it was in fact possible. It was really a message from the USSR to the United States and the rest of the world that it was a burgeoning superpower. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had emerged as superpowers after World War II. The Soviet Union leveraged raw territory gained during the war, and this was assisted by the fact that the war itself decimated most of Europe. This territory was separated by a buffer zone of countries known as the Iron Curtain. With more Soviet-aligned countries, the USSR had a steady flow of income to fund both its technological advancements and its attempts to push into the Middle East, as well as expand its sphere of influence throughout the world. On the other hand, unlike most of Europe and Asia, the United States was untouched by the damage of war, with the notable exception of Pearl Harbor, of course. In addition, while most of America's fighting-aged men were shipped off to Europe, Africa, and the Pacific, women in the States quickly pivoted the industrial base to efficiently churn out essentials for the military. As soon as the war came to an end, the men came home, and there was a booming economy waiting for them, complete with jobs and resources to boot. With factories still intact, the United States became the leading exporter for most goods to their World War II allies. This put America in an advantageous position of being able to supply the rest of the rebuilding world with much-needed raw supplies, but it also allowed the U.S. to grow what is known as soft power. Soft power, as opposed to hard power, is the export of a country's culture. For instance, in the modern day, South Korean culture has exploded in popularity with its own export of food like Korean fried chicken and Korean barbecue, music like K-pop, and even hit TV shows like Squid Game. As a result, those who consume Korean culture will have a favorable outlook on South Korea as a country. The United States employed a similar strategy after World War II. Known as the Marshall Plan, this set into motion a new type of foreign policy, utilized by the Truman administration, that aimed to not only rebuild Europe economically, but also spread the message of democracy versus that of communism. A byproduct of this was Europeans buying American goods and consuming American culture, much like how Americans are consuming that Korean culture today. This, in part, is what led to the Cold War. Remember the Cold War? But it was a conflict of ideals between the United States and Soviet Union. However, while there wasn't any overt warfare, i.e. the cold part, both nations, which now became known as superpowers, engaged in what was essentially a soft power war. And this led to the missile race, the precursor to the space race. Created by the Nazis, more than 3,000 V-2s were launched against England, France, and Belgium during the war. Immediately after World War II, the V-2 program met its end. The scientists who created them were among assets that were split as spoils between both the United States and the Soviet Union. And with that, the Cold War had begun. Both superpowers now had the technical knowledge to create ICBMs for themselves. The United States had the slight edge on the Soviets by developing and using the first atomic bomb in Japan. As a result of these developments, the USSR began to quietly develop Sputnik, the first man-made satellite sent into space. When it launched in 1957, the United States was taken aback. They were pissed. The Eisenhower administration initially tried to downplay how important the launch was, but in the background, kind of panicking.
People of the United States have been humiliated, they're disturbed, and they're unhappy.
What Eisenhower had hailed as a stunning scientific achievement and a step towards greater scientific cooperation was seen as a demonstration by the Soviets that they could launch a missile into space, thereby proving that they could strike the United States from vast distances, putting America's long-range strike programs to shame. Prior to this, the United States had put all its eggs in one plain basket, using the U-2 spy plane to gather intelligence on Soviet activities. With this, the US and allied nations sought to create bombers that would be able to deliver nuclear payloads onto Soviet targets. In addition, the successful launch of Sputnik had given the USSR a distinct advantage over the United States in surveillance capability. The launch of Sputnik had catapulted the Soviets to the forefront of the superpower rivalry. The United States had their response a year later in 1958 with their launch of the Explorer 1 satellite, but the damage to the American reputation had already been done. The development of satellite assets orbiting the Earth is considered a milestone for both the United States and the Soviet Union, not just because they were scientific advancements, but because they showed that the militarization of space was possible. If space could be filled with surveillance satellites, and possibly even missile launch platforms, then what could be done with Earth's closest astronomical neighbor? The Army had sought to answer this very question. In the 1950s, the Army created a prospective study known as Project Horizon that considered putting a manned outpost on the lunar surface. Project Horizon would be worked on in tandem with the development of the Saturn rocket systems, the same rocket series that would eventually get astronauts to the moon. In short, there would be multiple rocket launches, each with the objective to bring cargo to the moon's surface. While this was happening, the Army would also be sending astronauts to the moon to put the outpost together for long-term occupation. The only thing holding back this project from really getting off the ground was just a simple matter of the price tag, $58 billion. Still, to this day, the United States has been the only nation to successfully get humans onto the moon. The outcome of the Apollo 11 mission solidified America's victory over the Soviets in the space race. When the USSR conceded, both the Soviets and the United States began to cooperate on projects such as the International Space Station. This also opened the door for other nations like Canada and Japan and others to mount their own independent space agencies, now taking part in operation and maintenance of one of humanity's only residences outside of Earth. However, with this cooperation, it can be argued that the militarization of space had been hamstrung. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 was ratified by the UN and outlined some of the following. States shall not place nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction in orbit or on celestial bodies or station them in outer space in any other manner. And the moon and other celestial bodies shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. This means that WMDs of any kind are effectively ground only. But this didn't keep the United States from exploring theoretical systems using kinetic energy to hit targets from orbit. It sounded like something out of a near-future Star Wars, the rods from God, officially known as Project Thor. I don't know which one is the funnier name, but it was a theoretical space weapon used to launch 20-foot tungsten cylinders at speeds reaching Mach 10 into a target, causing an explosion similar to 11.5 tons of TNT. Conceptualized in the 1950s by Boeing engineer Jerry Purnell, Project Thor would be used to strike hardened underground targets with the same force as a nuclear warhead, but without all the deadly fallout from the materials. Tungsten was chosen due to its ability to withstand the head of re-entry through Earth's atmosphere. If put into application, each rod itself would cost around $230 million, and that's before the cost of complex satellites and operational support. Proposed by Lowell Wood and Edward Teller, Brilliant Pebbles, that's another solid project title, was a satellite-based system conceptualized to fire heat-seeking missiles at Soviet nuclear ICBMs and hopefully render nuclear weapons obsolete. Brilliant Pebbles was only one part of President Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, dubbed by the administration's critics as, you guessed it, considering the principle of mutually assured destruction between the Soviet Union and the United States to be morally reprehensible, Reagan aimed to make all nuclear weapons obsolete with satellite weapons. However, the idea of launching multiple satellites that would constantly orbit and track over the Soviet Union was deemed outlandish, and many of Reagan's critics considered this to be a way for him to pad the defense budget, as the development and deployment of such systems would have astronomical costs. See what I did there? While many would consider the development of this system to be useless, it did keep the USSR on its toes, with the issue of the SDI brought to the table in order for cooperation on the Nuclear Forces Treaty, which bans conventionally ground-launched ballistic cruise missiles, and strategic arms reduction talks. Reagan's refusal to let the SDI go was considered a sticking point for the USSR, and strategic arms reduction talks only became successful after Reagan left office. When Ronald Reagan's second term was up, it was assumed that the Brilliant Pebbles program would leave with him. But with the election of President George H.W. Bush, Brilliant Pebbles lived on. While initially only intended for the use against USSR, the end of the Cold War in 1989 opened up an opportunity for the program to be expanded. Evolving into the Global Protection Against Limited Strikes, or GPALS, Brilliant Pebbles would become a system of multiple satellites constantly orbiting Earth, specifically several staggered rings, all with intersecting orbits to ensure full coverage of global threats, thereby protecting American ground forces in any location. A couple of years into President Bush's only term, the first Gulf War began in the Middle East. with a Saddam Hussein-led Iraq invading Kuwait. Saddam was noted to have a variety of Scud missiles, and he wasn't afraid to use them. Thereby, President Bush transitioned the Strategic Defense Initiative into GPALs, seeking to incorporate 4 different components: a ground-based system to protect the United States, a ground and sea-based system for protection of U.S. and allied forces, a space system, and a command and control system. When this sort of system was proposed by Reagan to Congress, it was shot down due to the projected costs and strict military budget. When Saddam began using Scud missiles during the Bush administration, there was suddenly acclaim for this sort of forward defensive thinking. Multiple simulations were conducted with the aim of presenting this system, and by proxy, brilliant Pebbles, as a feasible missile defense system. However, during initial tests of single satellites out of the multiple satellite system, a series of catastrophic failures led to the program being slowly defunded. When Bill Clinton was elected, the brilliant Pebbles system was again renamed, this time to the Advanced Interceptor Technology, AIT program in 1993. Later that year, the program was killed off completely, with funds being diverted to other missile defense programs. To many people, space is hard to conceptualize. The big blue or big black sky has captured the imagination of many who simply look up and see nothing but infinity. It's an untapped resource of scientific wonder, and the general understanding in today's modern era would probably blow the minds of scientists and astronomers of the past. While the scientific discovery has captured the minds of observers, it has started a less than obvious arms race between multiple nations within the modern era. This arms race has produced many technologies that have improved everyday life, like GPS and memory foam. The question of how to get to space has been answered. What remains to be answered is how nations will militarize and weaponize it. The United States has already tried with its SDI and GPALS concepts. As of now, space has been considered off limits for overt warfare due to the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which limits the use for space to only peaceful activities. However, in spite of this treaty, of which 115 nations are party to, it could be argued that the militarization of space has long since begun. As of 2023, the United States has over 5,000 satellites in various zones of orbit circling the Earth, which is a number that eclipses the rest of the world's 7,500 or so satellites in orbit. And while a vast majority of satellites launched have been for commercial purposes, there are at least 200 that are military affiliated and over 100 for other government purposes. Due to the 1967 treaty, most of these satellites are for ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, with no capability to launch a weapon system. But should that treaty be revised and expanded? ISR capabilities are themselves, while not directly supporting kinetic warfare, tools of warfare nonetheless. And seeing as how it would be advantageous to poke out any rival's eye in the sky, should that be considered an act of war? Russia has begun testing the waters with alleged development of anti-satellite weapons. The idea being to disable neighboring satellites through electromagnetic pulses emitted by nuclear discharges, basically an EMP. If any satellite deemed vital for communications or GPS is destroyed, then the United States can lose its overhead eyes and ears if a conflict between near-peer adversaries ever erupts. The Chinese are also ramping up their own space capabilities. While not a part of the initial space race during the Cold War, China has created its own independent space agency, complete with its own independent space station. This space agency is directly controlled by the Chinese military government. During President Reagan's time, his Star Wars program was laughed at Congress, being constantly defunded due to cost overruns. But it could be argued that he was ahead of his time with his proposals for a comprehensive space defense plan. While not kinetic, satellites in space have proven themselves useful with navigation, communication, and surveillance capabilities that are valuable to the military and national security overall. Space itself is a possibly limitless resource that has much left to discover, but with militarization and constantly changing power dynamics, what should be the next steps to safely militarize space with intentions on deterrence? Should we be planning to mount Space Force ships that patrol orbit, like Navy carrier strike groups? Or perhaps load our next mission to the moon with military asset materials to arm the lunar surface with deterrent weapons before Russia or China have a similar idea? And what's the war doctrine on that? Did the US claim the moon with that American flag back in the 60s? A space-age Jamestown, if you will? I like to think not. I'm just happy there were no native lunarians up there for us to colonize, or else we may have actually made the whole Star Wars thing a reality. Space may be the one and only endeavor in history that actually forces us as humans to recognize how similar we all are and how intrinsically unified our species is. We see it in collaborations on the ISS and other space programs that enlist the minds of American, Russian, and Chinese alike. And not that the idea of an American-Indian war-style offensive against lunar natives isn't terrifying. It's an interesting thought experiment at what our supposed adversary yet fellow human earthbound foes would become if we were to be in a war beyond our shared planet. But that's a lot. Perhaps too much theoretical jargon for this discussion. I'm just gonna go watch Independence Day.
Welcome to Earth.